The 1984 Vaal Civic Association protests were a highly volatile time in the history of South Africa. The demonstrations included an organised stay-away, school boycotts and marches which led to clashes with apartheid police. The protests soon gathered momentum and became a national uprising. The Nationalist government responded with brutal force, leading to a tragic loss of lives and many arrests, including some of the United Democratic Front leaders. Gcina Malindi, who among those arrested, and the charges against him included treason, murder and terrorism and the intention to overthrow the government. This is how he came to be represented by human rights lawyer George Bizos. With us this morning we have advocate Gcina Malindi. It is so good to have you, advocate, and welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Leanne, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. More importantly, it's so good to have you here talking to your memories of George Bizos. And let's first, of course, get your reaction to the passing of such a great man.
First of all, condolences to the Bizos family and life to you, George. It is devastating news. He was 92 years old. It was expected amongst those who were close to him because they watched his health deteriorate over the last year in particular.
And that is unfortunately a reality. He did die and pass at the age of 92, so leading a full life, and unfortunately, leaving us at this time, which is, it's never easy. It doesn't matter at what age. But let's go back now. Let's talk about the time that you met him. Take us back to the time of how you got to get represented by Advocate George Bizos.
Well, I first met George in 1978 when he was at the Vanderbilt Park Magistrates Court to represent Khotso Siatludi, the Soweto Students Representative Council leader of the 1976 generation. I watched George in court and I thought, I want to be a lawyer one day. You can fast forward to June 1985. I found myself and 21 others represented by George Bizos and 4 other advocates. And that came about because of the Vaal uprising of 3 September 1984, when the Vaal Civic Association and other organizations like the Congress of South African Students organized a stay-away to protest against the rent increases during a time when the economy, especially of the Vaal and industrial area, was very depressed. Arising out of those uprisings, there were those protests. There was the response by the police. Many people were killed. About 4 local councillors were killed. And subsequent to that, a number of us, 16 from the Vaal, were arrested. And later, 3 UDF leaders were added. And 2 other leaders from the Black Consciousness Movement, Tom Mantata and Oba Hlomuga, were added to the trial, and that accounted for the 22 of us.
Yeah.
And I must say, having spent more than 400 days behind George Bizos, Arthur Chaskalson, Carol Tip, and others, it was a further inspiration for me to become a lawyer. That is how I met George Bizos,
wow,
who extinguished himself during that 3.5 to 4 years trial, which started in 1985 and ended in 1989 when we won on appeal in the Supreme Court of Appeal.
Isn't that an incredible story? And I mean, to be standing there, to be inspired by this man and to seeing who you are and the man that you are today, and the role that he played in it, and that in itself is amazing. You know, you talk of George Bizos. In those days, there were very few white people that did what he did. I mean, he was one of only a handful of lawyers who actually sought redress for victims of racial separation through the very legal system that actually went out and sanctioned it. And, you know, he was there also. We know him of the very high-profile cases that he represented and went out, but he was also out and doing a lot of small, going into rural areas and going into other courts where the apartheid system would, you know, not really sort of get, nobody would get any redress, but he would go in there and try and get justice. I mean, are you aware of any of these kind of things that he would do?
George Bizos, there was no political trial too small or too big. George represented political activists all over the country. He went into small towns. He went into big towns. He went into big trials and into small trials, which were mainly known then as the stone throwers trials, but George will be there. And it's recorded the number of people that George represented, from the treason trial of 1956 and the Rivonia trial itself, to representing other eminent political activists, especially in inquests such as the Steve Biko inquest, Neil Agate inquest, the Craddock 4 inquest, and representing the 22 from the Vaal, and taking charge of a defense of ordinary activists. The majority of us having been ordinary activists from the Vaal, but that's the role that George took. It was not because it was a treason trial. It was because George fought for justice through his legal skills and other means of bringing justice to our country. Like Bram Fisher, George believed that he must fight for a society that he wanted to live in.
Indeed.
He did not do it for blacks. He didn't do it for women. He did it in order to achieve a society in which all will be equal before the law, all will be equal in terms of economic and other socio-economic rights and freedoms.
And advocate, it never stopped. You know, we're talking about the bygone days and many years ago. But let's pull it even closer to home, to times that we're living in right now. Marikana. I mean, as recently as Marikana, we saw George Bizos, Advocate George Bizos, stepping up to the plate to represent 34 families whose loved ones were killed during the Marikana massacre. There he was, standing up once again for what he believed was right, even in his later part of his life.
Absolutely. That was my other opportunity to work with George, although I represented a different party in the Marikana Commission. And I was there for a few months, and George was in action again, seeking justice, seeking to expose the excesses of the security forces under democracy, just as he did during apartheid days.
Incredible, it really is. And besides all of that, again, we would listen to him, and during the years where this generation of South Africans was standing up and speaking about and speaking out about the corruption and the looting of the state, George Bizos, again, another individual. And I remember very clearly, I think it was at the memorial service of the late Nelson Mandela, where he stood up and he said, this is not the country that Nelson Mandela fought for. And he said those words and continued, with the likes of Ahmed Kathrada in speaking out against the brazen corruption that was happening at the time and that still unfortunately plagues us. Did you have these conversations with Uncle George offline? And because you did have a friendship with him and interacted as well. How did he feel? What were some of the things that he was feeling about South Africa, his chosen land?
George Bizos fought for a society where there will be freedom. He fought for a society where there'll be political and economic freedom. So it hurt him immensely when we in the ANC were seen to deviate from the principles of building a prosperous society for all. So George wished that we could live to the theme that the ANC adopted post-1994 to create a better life for all. And George will always try to prevail upon those leaders within our organization to alert them to the way in which we were deviating from the cause of freedom and the cause of making a better life for all. Mm-hmm. Not only was he in direct contact with Mandela, but Bizos believed in the cause of the ANC. Although he was not a formal member of the ANC, and he always wished to contribute towards steering it into more democratic means, into adopting policies that will benefit everyone in the country. George attended, I should believe, until recently, every conference of the ANC, attended every important meetings of the leaders of the ANC in conference or otherwise, to give of his time, his wisdom, and his legal ability, which he had exhibited together with many others when they were crafting the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa.
Yeah.
George Bizos fought the resistance of the nationalists and other white people who did not want to go the full way in advancing freedoms and economic freedoms within the Constitution when it was crafted from the early 1990s to the adoption of the final Constitution in 1996.
Indeed. And that, of course, was what our president last night spoke to, and also just reminding us how he was a great architect and one of those that contributed to writing the Constitution of South Africa. I want to bring up a quote that he said in his book, and I think this, as a child, we mentioned that at 13 years old, he arrived here in South Africa, came from Greece, came to the port of Durban, and when he arrived there, and I think this was in the 1940s, around about there, and he wrote this in one of his memoirs. This was quite a recent one. It was The Odyssey to Freedom. And I'm going to take a quote from this book. It was in 2007, I beg your pardon, that he published this, and he said, the first time when he arrived here in South Africa, he had seen a man doing work reserved for animals, and it shocked me greatly. And this he was referring to when he arrived in Durban and he saw black men consigned to hauling rickshaws. And this, he said, is what just changed him. Now, one would imagine that as a young boy coming into a country like that and seeing something like this, and then for the rest of your life dedicating your cause to that of others, this must be a defining, I suppose, characteristic of this man.
Absolutely. George saw injustices in ways that many of us, even South Africans who have suffered, would ignore.
Indeed.
Many of us saw the rickshaws as that beautiful part of being in Durban and being pulled by rickshaws. But George saw the injustice of that conduct. George, having come here, escaping war from his own country, had seen injustice, had seen suffering, he had seen how he survived and had to thank South Africa for his life and the life of those that were on that boat with him. And that is the conditions that George grew up in and he encountered in South Africa that brought the best out of him. Those were the conditions of apartheid that brought the best out of some of us and many of our leaders. Ironically, it is under these conditions of democracy that the West has come out of some of us. But George was consistent throughout. To his last days, George gave of his time, gave in charity to alleviate the lives of those who were wanting. And George saw his role in advancing freedom not as a career for reward. And George will often ask when briefed whether we were going to be paid. And if the attorneys said, well, George, we don't know because the funders have not agreed to funding the trial. And George will say, well, we have to do what we have to do.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
So he gave everything within his means. And legal craft was his means, and his humanity was his way of being a South African.
Final question, and Advocate, I'm going to ask you to answer it quite quickly. And having an advocate with us, I have to ask you this. One of the most famous things that stands out when you think of Advocate George Bizos is three simple words, if need be. And you know what I'm talking about, and I think South Africans know what I'm talking about as well. How important were those three words in the trial of Nelson Mandela? When he added, and this is what George Bizos insisted that he put into it, if need be, it is something, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. How important were those words?
Those words were very important, Leanne.
It's 7 hours.
There are causes in life which all of us, if needs be, we must die for. And that was true then when Mandela was making his speech from the dock, and George added those words. It is true today that the old generation that fought for freedom and the new generation that wishes to advance the freedom that we have attained so far, they must make a conscious decision that in the struggle for freedom, in the struggle for humanity, in the struggle for bringing a better life for all, we must all know that those freedoms that we must fight side by side for, if needs be, we must die for.
Thank you for talking to us, Advocate Gcina Malindi, talking to us about the human rights lawyer George Bizos, who left us last night. Let's, of course, get our news bulletin.